All right. Shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I would like to give all praise and glory to YAHAWAH, BAHASHAM, YAHAWASHI, BAHASHAM, Makakwadash. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone that taught us this truth. And salutations to the hopeful elect that's around the four corners of the globe. And the elect begins with the 144,000. Yahawah, who the world ignorantly calls God and Jehovah. BAHASHAM is in the name. YAHAWASHI, who the world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ. The Makakwadash, which is the Holy Spirit. On the brother I will lumia with the gym at Chicago camp out here in Chicago. Come back at true brothers and sisters of the household of faith of the Hope for Right Select with another lesson. And Lord, and I hope this lesson be edifying through the spirit and power of YAHAWASHI. Once again, I hope this lesson is edifying. I'm gonna just do a spiritual review on a movie I had seen this past Thursday. Entitled 40 Acres, man. And in this movie, just to give a quick synopsis, real quick. Ultimately, I'm gonna just basically talk about a few scenes that's in the movie, but just to overall say, the things that they showed in this movie is going to be a dark reality of what America is going to be, man. Just to really start off, the movie started off, basically gave the text how ultimately, America was plagued by a civil war. I believe they say what was that? Either America or I forget which one it was. But I'm gonna definitely watch this movie a second time, and ultimately how the land was ultimately ravaged by a famine because all the animals ultimately end up dying by a disease that ultimately end up wiping out all the animals. In this movie 40 Acres, they show cannibalism, they show betrayal, they show different things of that nature, man. And that's what's going to be a dark reality of America, man. As we see this place, Babylon the Great, which is America, on the constant decline, the different things that we seen in this movie, far as cannibalism, far as, famine, which is the lack of bread, far as, people turning on one another, that's going to be a dark reality for America, man. And we're living in that, in those times right now, man, and ultimately, the family, and which was so spiritual about this movie, man, you had Southern and the Northern Kingdom, they were together like family, man. You had Gadites, you had Southern Kingdom, you had Northern Kingdom, and they was ultimately working together, man. And I found that so spiritual, man. You had ultimately the Edomites, which were the cannibals, that was basically trying to take whatever Jake had, man. And let's actually start off with that precept. This is the book of Micah 2:2. It says, and they covered fields and take them by violence, and houses and take them away. So they oppress a man in his house, even a man in his heritage. And right, that's what this gang of Edomites were actually doing, man. They wanted to take over and take control, what Jake had, man, which is what? The 40 acres, which is what? Ultimately their farmland, man. Because ultimately to sustain and ultimately to get a meal and to eat, you actually had to grow something, and, and being a farmer was a big thing in this movie, man. Because that's how ultimately, people got their food and how ultimately people were sustained, man. Farm work, growing your own food, because like I mentioned in the movie, all the animals died of a disease that basically, took all the animals out. So ultimately that was a big hit to the food supply, man. And you see here in Babylon the Great, which is America, you see what, store shelves, ultimately it's becoming empty, man. Ultimately, what's that? Bill Gates basically batting up all the farmland, man. All this is by design, man. And which is going to lead to here in America, man, a cannibalism. And it's going to lead to cannibalism worldwide, man. But here in America, man, it's going to be a special case, man. But ultimately, those Edomites, man, which are ultimately cannibals, they were ultimately trying to, take control of what Jake had, man. And this is Esau's MO, But let's continue. This is the book of John 10:10. It says, the thief cometh not but for to steal and to kill and destroy, and I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. Right? This the characteristics of the so-called white man, which are the Edomites, man. They steal, they kill, and they destroy, man. Those gang of Edomites, which were ultimately cannibals, which what they was trying to do, man. And there was a particular scene in that movie, man, that showed the true nature of Esau Edom, man. It was a, like I said, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the movie, hey, go watch it. But ultimately, spoiler alert, you had a scene, where you had the Gadite, which was a part of the family, with Southern Kingdom, he ultimately, went to go, see what was wrong with the borders of their farmland or whatnot. But ultimately, you had Esau Edom, dressing himself up as an animal, basically disguising himself as an animal, and it basically took Jake off guard because, like I said before, all the animals were wiped out by a disease that basically, was a big hit to the food, man. People couldn't hunt for food or things of that nature because what? All the animals were ultimately killed by the disease. So ultimately, you had this Edomite basically disguise himself as an animal to throw Jake off guard, and ultimately, what ended up happening, man? They end up getting the jump on Jake, and ultimately, Esau, what this Edomite did was ultimately tried to eat this man, raw. No pun intended, but just eat him, without actually killing him first, basically eating him alive, man. And that's just going to be, what's going to touch the soils of America, man. When these people go hungry, especially the average American, man, when they can't actually eat, and they're going to go to means of cannibalism, man. And that's what these Edomites were actually doing. They were hunting Jake down to ultimately to eat them, man. And a lot of these Americans, best believe is going to resort to cannibalism, man. Let me see, and this is a particular point I want to touch upon because let me see real quick. Oops. Yep, because there was a particular scene in the movie, going into the beginning of the movie, how I just basically mentioned, you had the subtitles ultimately, talked about what, the things that ultimately led up to the famine, man, and which eventually led to a civil war, But ultimately, like I said, this is a distant, a dark reality, for America, man. And we're witnessing these different signs that's ultimately leading up to a famine, that's ultimately leading up to a civil war. This is the book of 2nd Ezra 6:22. And suddenly shall the sown places appear unsown. It says the full storehouses shall suddenly be found empty. With these different tariffs that Donald Trump is putting on these different countries, man, it's costing, it's basically having the cost of goods go up, things of that nature. Hey, the imports, we're seeing less of imports of canned goods and food to America, man. It's going to cause these different store houses shelves to go empty, man. And that's the first sign of a famine, man. And going back to the movie, man, ultimately everything that I'm talking about, it led towards the famine, man. The animals dying out, farmland, and ultimately, you had people ultimately hunting other people to get a meal, man, which resulted in what? Cannibalism. Verse 23, it says, and the trumpet shall give a sound, which when every man heareth, they shall be suddenly afraid. Because there's going to be a lot of people that's going to be afraid out here, man. And just to say also, man, you had the leading character, which was the so-called black woman, basically doing some heroic raw shit. Hey, so best believe in the times that we're coming into, man, because this is reality we talking about, man. A lot of these bitches are going to be scared, man. Because what? It says men shall be afraid, man. How much more to these women, man? You're not going to have, a 007 woman basically whooping ass out here when all hell breaks loose, man. Hey, that's not what's going to happen, man. A lot of these bitches are going to be hiding. A lot of these bitches are going to be a lot of the casualties you're going to see out here, man. And if you're going to see men afraid, how much more women, man? So you had, the women of that movie doing some heroic shit, man. Even better than the men. And ultimately what? Here in America, man, when all hell breaks loose, man, we're not going to see any of that shit, man. And like I said, what was so spiritual about that movie, you had Southern and Northern Kingdom together living as a family. I found that very spiritual, man. Because ultimately what? We know that what? The Lord, is bringing the tribes together, starting with the elect, man. This is the book of Zechariah 9:13. It says, when I had bent Judah for me, filled the bow with Ephraim, and raised up thy sons, O Zion, against thy sons, O Greece, and made thee as a sword of a mighty man. And right, talking about, these different race wars that's eventually going to happen, man. Because ultimately in that movie, what's that? I said like the last 25, 30 minutes, or the last 20, 25 minutes of the movie, you had Esau, these Edomites ultimately raid the farm to take their farmland and to ultimately eat Jake. You had Jake band together to go against these Edomites, man. And they was fucking some shit up, man. Jake was, giving Esau a run for his money, man. And that's ultimately what the Lord is going to do, starting with the elect. The Lord is going to what? Raise up the elect to ultimately to do damage to these other nations, starting with Esau Edom, man. You know? And we're going to have spiritual powers up top of that, man. And like I said, this movie is a must watch, man. It basically give us a deep dive of what the future of America is going to be. And ultimately what? The Southern and the Northern Kingdom coming together, man. The tribes, you know? You know, those two sticks becoming one stick. You know? You know, talking about Judah and Ephraim, man. Hey, the Southern and the Northern Kingdom coming together, man. And that was a beautiful thing, which was one of my favorite parts of that movie, man. 40 Acres, you know? But let's continue. This is the book of 2 Esdras 15 and 19. It says, a man shall have no pity upon his neighbor, but shall destroy their houses with the sword and spoil their goods because of the lack of bread and for great tribulation. All right, that's why ultimately people were fighting, you know, within this movie, man, because what? You know, the famine was real. Hey, you ain't had no way to eat. If you wasn't a farmer, or if you didn't have farm land, you know, it was no way for you to eat, man. So you had a lot of people, what? Resorting to cannibalism, like I said, you know, early in the lesson, man. You know? So ultimately you had acts of betrayal. People betraying one another. You know, the mother, you know, the main character, the black woman, she ultimately, it was hard for her to ultimately trust individuals, you know, to step on her farmland, man. You know? Which she ultimately, you know, end up being right, man, because ultimately what? You know, you even had, you know, a lot of Edomites dressed up as, you know, the military, which they ultimately killed to trick, you know, individuals that ultimately came across them, man. You know? To ultimately to get the upper hand on them, to ultimately to kill them, to ultimately eat them, man. You know? And that's what these Edomites were doing in this movie, man. So best believe when all hell breaks loose, when there's no 911 and these different militia groups ultimately come together, man, when there's famines out here, just know there's gonna be a gang of cannibals running after people, capturing people, eating people, man. You know, because of what? The lack of bread and for great tribulation, man. These are the dark things that we're gonna see, man. Hey, expect, you know, limbs spread out everywhere on the streets of America, man. You know, we're coming to that dark reality, man. You know? But let's continue. And this is another point I want to bring up too. I already, you know, loosely touched upon it, but I want to go even more into it. You know, how ultimately, you know, they had the black woman doing some heroic shit. Like I said, a lot of these women ain't gonna be doing shit. Talking about reality, man, when all hell truly breaks loose here in America, man, when 911 start working and things of that nature, man. You know, because like I said, a lot of these women are going to be the casualties out here. This is the book of 2 Esdras 16 and 33. It says, the virgin shall mourn having no bridegrooms. The women shall mourn having no husbands. Their daughters shall mourn having no helpers. Meaning what? The men are going to die off, man. You know, you're going to have some of the men being shipped to war. You know, things of that nature, man. You know, this is the dark reality that we're heading to, man. You're not going to have women out here doing some 007 shit. You know, hey, running across walls, getting the upper hand on men. You know, because you had this black woman basically fighting like 4-5 Edomites off at one time, man. You know, a lot of these women are going to be running. A lot of these women are going to be put to death, man. There's not going to be any, you know, heroic women out here, man, doing some military type of fighting, man. You know, that's the stuff they put in these different movies and things like that to, you know, to ultimately to push their propaganda and to push that feminism out there. But ultimately, these women are going to be fucked up in the times that's to come, man. You know, let's actually grab one more and I'm gonna close out. You know, I'm gonna definitely see this movie again, Lord willing, and it's definitely a movie that brothers and sisters shall watch. You know, should watch to ultimately, to just to get a glimpse of what's to come, man. This is the book of Luke 23 and 31. And the scriptures, basically, explains it perfectly, man, the trouble and the hell that's to come. This is the book of Luke 23 and 31. It says, for if they do these things in the green tree, what shall be done in the dry? Right, because we're somewhat in the green tree right now, where we can go to the stores, buy our food. There's 911, you can call for help. It says, what shall be done in the dry? And that movie was a perfect example of the dry, man. No food, people trying to, take what you have. People trying to eat you. That's the signs of what? The dry. And we're approaching that time very fastly, man. When all hell breaks loose, when civil wars, rampant on the shores of America, man. When there is no food, when you're gonna have a group of cannibals ultimately trying to come after you and kill you, man. You know, just to say at the end of the movie, you know, they ultimately, you know, rejoice. You know, you had more Jakes ultimately join them at the end of that movie, and they ultimately rejoice at the end at the dinner table. You know, ultimately, ultimately overcame Esau Edom, the Edomites. But ultimately, what? The only ones that's going to overcome in the end is the elect, man. You know, if you don't have YAHAWASHI, YAHAWASHI on your side, hey, your ass is grass, man. So ultimately, you know, just my review of 40 Acres, man. Hey, a movie, you know, Jake should definitely watch. Lord, when I hope this lesson was edifying, you know, something I wanted to touch upon real quick. You know, Lord, when I hope this lesson was edifying, I want to end up giving all praise, honor, glory to YAHAWAH, BAHASHAM, YAHAWASHI, BAHASHAM, Rakakwadash. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of great millstone that taught us the truth. And salutations to the hopeful elect that's around the four corners of the globe. Lord, when I hope this lesson was edifying. Until next time, Kwam Yasharallah, Shalom, and the Bible Ball. Until next time, Lord willing.